Hello, and welcome to Whatever Wednesday with Burkhart Books, the podcast. I'm your host, Dianne Burkhart. I hope you'll subscribe and join me every Wednesday for, well, whatever. Let's get on with our show today. Hello, everyone. Today is March 23rd, 2022, and we have got a very special podcast today because today we're going to get to hear from another indie author in the Western genre. This man is a former English teacher, the author of a series of traditionally published books, as well as currently doing some self-publishing. He is also the lucky husband of a fantastic woman named Susie, and he happens to be a personal friend of mine. Mark Redmond. Thank you so much for being on my podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
The first thing we want to do is talk about your Western series, because you also write Western books, but in a different target market than what mine are. So what are your books about?
Well, I have a couple of series. The first series I wrote is a 6-book middle grade Western fiction series set in post-Civil War Texas. The series title is The Adventures of Artie Anderson. I was an English teacher for 28 years, and as I was writing these books, getting them published and selling them at school visits and stuff, the parents of my students started working on me saying, hey, enough of the kids' books. When are you going to write something for us? So I wrote the first 2 books in a bounty hunter series for more mature readers, and then also a book of short stories called Five for the Trail for grown-ups. I mean, there's nothing in there that kids couldn't read as well. There's nothing harmful or anything. I don't use bad language in my books. There are no sex scenes or anything like that. The series that I started is the Bounty Hunter series is Nate Landry, Bounty Hunter, and I'm working on the 3rd book in that series at the moment. Then I just started another series late last year, another middle grade series. This one, because I live in Arizona now, this one I set in post-Civil War Arizona territory, and it centers around 5 siblings who wind up losing their parents, and it's the one that I'll read the first chapter from that. That's what I have now. I have short stories out that aren't Westerns that I published in order to get to where somebody would pay attention to me and take me seriously as an author.
Oh, I know that feeling. I'm glad you explained that, because I thought the Five for the Trail was part of the Bounty Hunter thing, but that's a short story collection?
Yes, ma'am. There are 6 short stories in there. Back in the Old West, experienced cowboys carried a 6-shooter with only 5 chambers loaded, and they kept an empty chamber under the hammer so that as they rode through brush or over rocks or something, their gun didn't go off accidentally and either shoot them in the leg or shoot their horse. Then when they stopped, if they were facing trouble or anything, then they put an extra cartridge in to make it 6. So I called the book Five for the Trail and put an extra short story in there to make it 6.
I love that. That is so clever. That is a great story to have behind the scenes sort of thing, too. I love that.
Thank you.
When did you first start writing these?
Oh, boy. It's been a long, long time. The first Artie Anderson book was published in 1999, but Diane, I know you know this. If you work with a traditional publisher, and that first series is published by a traditional publisher, everything else I have so far is self-published. I started sending that manuscript out and trying to get people to look at it and get somebody interested in publishing it 11 years before it got published.
Yeah.
That's how long it took.
Yeah, that does not surprise me at all. I think that's the one thing that discourages so many creative minds is the process of having to get published. It's not actually the writing or having to deal with the editing and things like that. It's the process of getting your work noticed and getting it published. That's the part that's draining.
That's true. If you're going to try to get somebody to publish your book, you have to have thick skin.
Oh, yeah.
Because you're going to get some editors are very courteous. They explain why the book isn't a good fit. Others just basically say no.
Yeah. Well, and even when you're doing self-publishing, some of the reviews that you can get from people can be pretty biting too.
Yep, that's true.
I think anytime you want to put your creative endeavors out to the public, you have to be ready for people to hate it. I mean, there's always going to be
Yep.
somebody who loves it, but you have to be prepared for people to hate it too.
And you just have to let that roll off you and realize that's just somebody's opinion.
Exactly. Everything's not going to be for everyone.
Right. And writing Westerns the way you and I do, for sure, Westerns aren't for everyone.
Oh, yeah. So now what is the next thing that you have planned? What is the next big thing that you would like to try? Do you want to give a podcast a try?
My agenda for this year, I'm working on that next Nate Landry book, the third one in the series.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, I just started, again, I'm an old guy, so I'm kind of a technological dinosaur. But my son helped me get a YouTube channel set up. So I have a series that I'm posting videos on my YouTube channel called the First Chapter series. And I read the first chapter of the first two Artie Anderson books. This weekend, I hope to pick up there and maybe finish the series by reading the first chapter of each book.
I actually just saw that.
Oh, good. I do have to tell you, I'm not quite as smooth a reader as you are, but a lot of times people enjoy hearing the author read the book.
Oh, yeah.
And I figured this would be good practice for me for when I start doing the audiobooks. I want to go through each one of my books, including the new one that hasn't been published yet.
Do you want to practice reading one of your books right now?
Sure. This is the first chapter from the new middle grade series I started. It's called the Box M Gang. It'll be the adventures of the Box M Gang, the series. And this one is the one that's set in post-Civil War Arizona territory. And it's told by the 15-year-old daughter. But this is chapter 1. When I found Pa lying on the stable floor one morning, I knew he was dead before I rolled him over. Doc Greenwood had told us almost a year ago that something was wrong with Pa's heart. Pa hadn't looked or acted sick, so we reckoned the problem must not have been too serious. Sitting with my back against one of the stalls, I began planning what to do next. I reckon most folks believe that a 15-year-old girl ought to cry when one of her parents dies, and I did cry when Ma passed. In fact, I couldn't stop crying. 2 years later, I still cried whenever I thought about her. But as I sat there looking at Pa, I felt no sadness. I shed no tears. I had loved him because he was my father. I had never liked him. Pa had been a hard man. He had driven Ma and his 5 children instead of leading us. There had been no tenderness in him toward any of us. Ma told me once that fighting in the war had changed him, but I always reckoned she'd just been trying to justify his behavior. He's dead, ain't he, Ruth? I jumped at the sound of Thad's voice. He had entered the stable silently, walking the way Pa had taught him. He had paused just inside the door, but then he glided to the stall and sat beside me. He put his arm around my shoulders, and neither of us spoke for a while. Finally, Thad broke the silence. I reckon you should tell the young'uns, he said. I always smiled when Thad referred to our younger sister and 2 brothers as the young'uns because they weren't much younger than the 2 of us. We don't want them coming out here and seeing Pa like this. I'll dig a grave beside Ma's. Maybe you should come in the house with me before you do any digging, I said. Let's tell the others together. I reckon we need to talk about a few things. Thad gave me a curious look, but he helped me to my feet and followed me into the house. Although I was a year older than Thad, I had never tried to boss him around. We had always been friends. The 5 of us gathered around the large oak table in the kitchen. Billy and Bart sat across from me. Where's the grub? Asked Billy. I'm hungry. I smiled. Like most 8-year-old boys, Billy was always hungry. I reckon that was why he was nearly as big as Bart, who was 2 years older. Where's Pa? Asked Bart. He went to the stable, said Sarah. At 12, she was often mistaken for my twin, or even, to her delight, my older sister. I'll tell him to wash and come to breakfast. She pushed her chair back and started toward the door. Wait, I said. Sarah looked over her shoulder at me but kept walking. Why? She asked. Glancing at the stove, she grinned. Well, I declare, Ruthie Martin, you haven't prepared our breakfast yet. What have you been doing that was so important that you neglected your duties? Pa isn't going to be happy about this when I sit down, Sarah, I said. You're not the boss of me. Sarah opened the door. Pa's not coming to breakfast, I said. Today or ever again. Sarah closed the door, tiptoed back to the table, and sat beside me. Staring at the table, she reached to take my hand. What do you mean? She whispered. Did Pa run away? Billy asked. Last year Johnny Davis ran away to join the army, said Bart. Did Pa run away to join the army? Billy asked. No, I said. Pa died. Then, not because of losing Pa, but because of the hurt I saw in those three faces, I cried. Billy and Bart cried too, but Thad and Sarah just sat, staring at the table. Nobody spoke for a while. Billy had leaned forward on the table and buried his face in his arms. He startled the rest of us when he sat up and wailed, We're orphans! The sheriff's going to take us to the orphan house. Getting Billy to settle down took some time. Thad built a fire in the stove, and I made us some flapjacks for breakfast. As I worked, I planned. We ate in silence. When everybody but Billy had finished, I began to share my plan. If we all work together, I said, I think we can stay here instead of going to the orphanage. Billy's right, Sarah said. As soon as folks find out Pa's dead, the sheriff will come out with the buckboard and haul us to the orphanage. Billy started wailing again. We're going to the orphan house. After we had settled Billy down for the second time, I started over. If we all work together, I said, I think we can stay here. We can't stay here now that Pa's gone, Thad said. Sarah's right. As soon as folks find out, the sheriff will come for us. Billy opened his mouth and covered his eyes. Stop, Billy, I said. Don't you start fussing again until you hear me out. I looked around the table at what was left of my family. Sarah's right. Once the town folks find out that Pa's gone, they'll want to put us in the orphanage. That's why we're going to make sure they don't find out. Four mouths dropped open. I couldn't keep from smiling just a little. Think about it, I said. Pa doesn't have to be alive to keep us out of the orphanage. Folks just have to think he's alive. If we work together, we can keep this place going without him. I looked at Thad. To start with, I said, we need to bury Pa where no one will see his grave. Burying him next to Ma would spill the beans. Billy whimpered. Beans is all they feed them orphans at the orphan house. Bart, you and Billy get dressed and tend to the livestock, I said. Sarah, clear the table and wash the dishes. Give Thad and me an hour, and then bring the boys to that stand of cottonwoods by the swimming hole. Sarah shoved her chair back and stood with her hands on her hip. She sneered and shook her head. You are not the boss of me, she said. Just because Pa is gone. Fine, I said. Just pack a carpet bag with whatever you want to take to the orphanage. We don't want the sheriff to have to wait when he brings the buckboard to haul us away. I pushed my chair in, turned, and walked toward the door. With my hand on the latch, I said, Thad, if we're going to the orphanage, we don't need to hide Pa's grave. I reckon we can just bury him beside Ma and save ourselves some trouble. No, wait, Sarah said. I'm sorry. I'll clear the table and wash the dishes. You and Thad bury Pa near the cottonwoods. When I turned to look at Sarah, she was pale. Her hands were clasped in front of her. I smiled and nodded at her. Thank you, Sarah, I said. I don't know if we can get away with what we're planning or not. I do know that our only hope will come through all of us working together. I'll hitch the roan to the wagon and get a couple of shovels, Dad said. The cottonwoods are too far away for us to carry Pa. I'm coming too, I said. Sarah will see you and the boys in about an hour. Please bring Ma's Bible with you. As I followed Thad outside and pulled the door closed behind me, the sun warmed my face. Birds were calling each other, and a bee buzzed past my head. We neared the stable, and I smelled the familiar odors of our livestock. Everything around me seemed as it should be, but I shuddered. I had never been more afraid. That's chapter 1.
That is so good.
Thank you.
And whenever they were talking about they don't want to go to the orphanage, I just started giggling. Because since my first one is all about the kids going to the orphanage.
I know. I thought about that when I was writing that. I thought there were orphanages all over the place back then. There had to be.
Well, and you know, part of the reason why I got the idea for my storyline was because my father and his sisters actually were in a children's home for a while.
Oh, my.
It was just that his parents had divorced and they didn't deem his mother capable of taking care of the kids, and they didn't give kids to single fathers back then. No. So they put all 4 of the kids into a children's home, and they lived there for a couple of years. And wow. Some of the things that I had happening to my characters in the orphanage happened to my dad in the children's home.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's where we get our material.
Yeah. My dad was actually really thrilled, since he's, the face of Stephen Burkhart for me. He's really thrilled that I was basing so much of the reality on his reality.
That's fantastic. Way to honor him.
I thank you so much for reading that. That was a great story to share with everybody who's listening. All 20 of them. Actually,
we have to start somewhere.
Well, and actually the numbers have been going up quite a lot. 20 was like the first one. I love joking about that, because I think that actually gets people sharing it more. They're like, oh, well, this was good. More people need to hear this. And then they share it.
Well, I'm one of those 20 who listens every week.
Oh, thank you so much. You have no idea how much your encouragement always means to me. Thank you so much. And I hope that you will come back whenever you get the next book out, and maybe we can have you do a reading from the new one.
Oh, I would love to. Thank you so much for having me, Diane.
If you enjoyed today's reading from Mark Redmond, you can find all of his books on Amazon.com and on his own website, marklredmond.com. Don't worry about trying to find those. I'll put links in the description of this podcast, so they'll be very easy for you to find. Now, I think we have a few minutes left, so how about we try and finish out Chapter 3 of my book, Into the West, The Orphan Train, by Stephen Burkhart. Continuing Chapter 3. Mrs. Kelly sat quietly with the children for a while, then gave them both a gentle hug before standing up.
Now, Connor, I need you to sit here with your sister. I need you both to give me one shoe so I can find you some new ones,
said Mrs. Kelly in an attempt to get their minds on something else. Connor put his clothes on the bench and sat down next to Elizabeth. Mrs. Kelly took one shoe from each of them and went to search the shelves for their sizes. Connor sat swinging his legs and humming while he looked through his clothes again. Eventually, he turned back to Elizabeth. Connor looked at her for a while, with an expression growing more and more serious. He finally spoke.
Lizzie, do you think Mom would be mad if I like it here?
He asked in a sad voice. Elizabeth wanted to hug her little brother, but she was afraid it would hurt too much. She settled for reaching out and taking his hand in hers and giving it a squeeze.
No, Connor, I don't think Mom will be mad at you at all. She will always want you to be happy wherever you are. That is what real love is,
answered Elizabeth. Then she carefully leaned over and kissed her little brother on the head. Mrs. Kelly heard the children talking and couldn't help smiling when she heard what Elizabeth said to her brother. This was clearly a special little girl. Mrs. Kelly was going to make it her mission to find her and her brother a good home. After Mrs. Kelly found the correct size shoes for the children, she left the room for a moment and came back with carpet bags for each of them to put their things in. She explained the bags were also theirs to keep, so they would have something to put their new clothes in when they left the foundling home. Mrs. Kelly was careful not to say anything about them going to a new home again. That discussion would all come in good time. but today was not the day for it. Mrs. Kelly got Sister Mary Agnes to take Connor back to his room and help him put his things away while she went with Elizabeth. By the time they were done, it was time for lunch. Elizabeth, Connor, and Carrie sat together again and waited for the meal bell. Today, lunch was a warm stew and a piece of fresh bread. Elizabeth didn't remember eating this well since before Connor was born. After they were done eating, Mrs. Kelly once again came for them. This time, she took them to one of the classrooms in the main hall. This room was directly across from Sister Mary Clare's bedroom. It made Elizabeth very uncomfortable being so close to that room again. Mrs. Kelly had them sit at a desk, and she gave them each a slate board and a piece of chalk. She explained that she was going to ask them questions and see what kind of things they already knew. Then she could decide what she would need to teach them to get them ready to join the other children on the train on Friday, and if there was time enough to do it. Mrs. Kelly weighed her words carefully when talking about the train trip, so as not to upset the children. Mrs. Kelly was very pleased to find Elizabeth was fairly well educated for her age, given her station and current situation. Even Connor seemed to have started to pick up some reading skills, which was quite impressive for a child so young. It said a great deal about the devotion their mother must have had to her children. When their class time was nearly over, Mrs. Kelly sat down with the children and asked if they had any questions for her about the foundling home or the rules here. Connor asked questions about the train. Elizabeth could tell Connor didn't understand what riding on this train meant for them. He was just excited about the idea of riding on a train someday. Honestly, Elizabeth didn't fully understand herself, but she knew it meant getting further away from their mother and making any chance of them getting home that much more hopeless. Elizabeth didn't have the heart to explain the situation to him. Mrs. Kelly did her best to answer his questions without giving him too much information just yet.
Well, Connor, the train is for children who are ready to meet new families. They have learned some accomplishments and they have finished all their studies. They know how to act like polite boys and girls when in society, she explained.
Connor looked sad as he asked, "So does that mean Lizzie and I can't go on the train ride this Friday?" Mrs. Kelly had hoped she could take them with her on this trip, but even as intelligent as they both seemed to be, she didn't think they would be ready in time. Regretfully, she said,
"I'm sorry, Connor, but I don't think so."
Connor dropped his gaze. His disappointment was obvious.
"Try not to let this upset you,"
said Mrs. Kelly. When the children didn't respond, Mrs. Kelly continued,
"And unfortunately, it won't be long until we have so many children in the home again that we'll have to take another group on the train. And I promise, you will be ready to go on the next train trip if you are still with us."
Elizabeth sat with her head down too, looking at her slate as she asked in a quiet voice,
"How long will you be gone?" "Well, I'm really not sure, Lizzie. I won't be gone very long, and you will have Sister Mary Teresa to help you with your studies until I get back. But we have to make several stops to find enough people for all the children to meet," said Mrs. Kelly.
It was difficult to talk about the train and not mention finding new families to adopt the children. However, Mrs. Kelly knew it was much too soon for them to think about such things after their mother surrendering them just one day before.
"It might take a few weeks at most."
Elizabeth looked across the hall at Sister Mary Clare's room. She quickly looked down at the slate in her lap as the nun walked into view and went into her room. Elizabeth started to quietly cry. The idea of being here for weeks with Sister Mary Clare without Mrs. Kelly was frightening. Mrs. Kelly looked where Elizabeth had been looking and knew what had upset the little girl. Many of the children were afraid of Sister Mary Clare, and with good reason. The woman was intimidating to adults. Mrs. Kelly could only assume how scary she was to children. Mrs. Kelly hated seeing this look on such a kind little girl's face. She made a split-second decision that would change all of their lives.
"I'm going to make you a deal," said Mrs. Kelly. "If you work very, very hard, I will do my best to get you added to the list of children on the train with me this Friday."
As soon as she spoke, both children immediately looked happier, but Mrs. Kelly didn't want to get their hopes up too much, in case she couldn't make it happen.
"Now, this is not a guarantee. Before any child is allowed to go out to meet new people, they must prove they are ready. You two will have to prove you have learned the basic skills the foundling home requires of its wards. If you can't do that, you will not be added to the travel list. Is that clear?"
asked Mrs. Kelly. Both children nodded their heads yes, but still looked to be in better spirits than before. Mrs. Kelly felt so guilty. She knew Connor didn't really understand what riding the train meant. For him, it just meant a fun train ride. Elizabeth might understand, but the girl was more afraid of being left behind with Sister Mary Clare than she was of being placed in a home in the West. Mrs. Kelly knew the children would not be happy if they understood riding the train meant being taken hundreds of miles away and placed in a home of strangers, never seeing their mother again. Mrs. Kelly finished up their class by writing a short poem on each of their slates and told them to work on memorizing it before their next class tomorrow afternoon. This would be a good test to see how quickly they could learn their accomplishments. Mrs. Kelly went over their poems several times with Connor to make sure he could identify all the words on his slate before they finished for the day. Mrs. Kelly walked the children back to the main hall and told them to go put their slates in their cupboards, then come back. By the time they got back to the hall, there were lots of children gathered by the front doors. Mrs. Kelly explained it was time for them to go out and get some fresh air. Sister Mary Teresa was going to take the children outside for playtime. Mrs. Kelly told Connor to go find his roommates while she talked to Elizabeth.
"Come with me, Lizzie,"
said Mrs. Kelly as she turned and walked into her office. When Elizabeth came into the office, Mrs. Kelly closed the door and went to the cabinet and pulled out a little jar. Mrs. Kelly pulled the stopper out of the top and sat them both on her desk. Mrs. Kelly held her hand out toward Elizabeth and said,
"Come here, Lizzie. Let's see about doctoring those lashes."
Elizabeth slowly walked over to Mrs. Kelly and took her hand. She was scared this was going to hurt. But Mrs. Kelly told her she was going to be as gentle as she could and asked if it was okay to start with the ones on her feet. After Elizabeth nodded yes, Mrs. Kelly picked her up and sat her gently on her desk and removed her shoes and socks. What she saw made her cringe. Even though she had just met her, she was continually amazed at the strength of this little girl. The welts on the soles of her feet were substantial, and the deep blue bruises had blossomed out from the welts. The marks had to hurt a great deal. Mrs. Kelly had renewed respect for Elizabeth. Gently, she applied the salve to all her wounds and made sure they were well covered before helping Elizabeth back down off her desk. She smiled at Elizabeth and stroked her hair. She was going to do everything she could to help this little girl. She deserved to be in a loving home.
"Lizzie, I really want to take you and Connor with me this Friday, so please, do your very best to learn all your studies and be ready to go with us. Can you do that for me?"
Mrs. Kelly asked. Elizabeth stood for a moment looking at Mrs. Kelly. She thought the woman looked a little sad. She had seen that look on her mother's face from time to time. Just like with her mother, Elizabeth wanted to do what she could to make her feel better.
"Yes, ma'am. I promise."
Elizabeth stepped closer to Mrs. Kelly and once again laid her head on Mrs. Kelly's chest. Mrs. Kelly reached down and brushed Elizabeth's hair back from her face and gently patted her head as she said,
There, there.
And this brings us to the end of Chapter 3. Thank you for listening. Be sure to check back next week with our next episode of Whatever Wednesday with Burkhart Books and me, your host, Dianne Burkhart.